Hey, it's Ariel. I wanted to talk about how I think describing seizures is so difficult. I wanted to say that I truly believe that anyone can have a lot of compassion and empathy for someone who's experienced anything. Like, even if you've never had a seizure or been ill, have a chronic illness or something like that, have depression, anything. Like, I think you can have compassion and empathy for them. I don't agree when some people say, like, well, you just don't know what it's like, so you won't understand. Like I said, I think there's a certain amount that we can all understand when someone's going through something. I do think that it really is impossible to explain to somebody who's never had a seizure what exactly it is, the experience. Because I am someone who's had, you know, regular experiences and seizures. And literally, the seizures are not anything that I've ever experienced in life besides that. So I just know that people who have never had a seizure, there's no way to really describe it to them because it's just different. It's like something I've never experienced outside of a seizure. So they don't really know what you're talking about when you explain it, because all you can do is relate it to things that somebody knows. And so one of the problems that I've seen with focal aware seizures with temporal lobe epilepsy, especially because sometimes they can be very cause like emotions, like anxiety, and I would get like an adrenaline rush from my anxiety. And I think that was part of what also I just like wanted to get out of wherever I was, because I would feel so overwhelmed suddenly and I didn't know why, what was going on. So that was definitely pretty awful. And I'll talk more about that in another video, because what the problem was is that I didn't know how to explain it to anyone, because I really, like, if I were to say it in my, mind of like what I would say to someone, I was just like, that sounds crazy. And it's like, I knew I wasn't crazy, but I just knew that if I explained it to someone, it just sounded crazy. Because all I could do is explain it using terms that someone understood, and it usually sounds psychiatric. Like if you tell someone that it's a sudden rush of an emotion, and yet you could say it's also like this deja vu experience and it feels more real than real life, and it, things that other people with seizures are like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I can say that to somebody who's never experienced a seizure, and they can try to imagine what it's more real than real life means, but probably they're going to be kind of like, that's weird, because it's something they've never experienced. And so honestly, they'll oftentimes just think that since it's off out of their concept of reality that they've never experienced, that it's probably something mental that is like somebody having, some kind of episodes of psychosis. I think it's really, and you can get psychosis in between seizures if you don't have enough time and stuff to get out of the seizure state, in the post-ictal state. And so there is a thing called interictal psychosis. But right now I'm just talking about the actual seizures. You're not crazy during a seizure. It's just that what it causes, and it makes sense, it's a rhythmic misfiring in your brain. But when it fires in an area that is usually a, where an emotion happens, it's like, how do you explain to someone that it's like an emotion, but it feels different and it's sudden and it doesn't have anything to do with the surroundings and what you're doing and what's going on? And I think that was one of the biggest things that for me made it seem different than, what I thought would be, say, an experience of just like, some other kind of mental disorder, like schizophrenia, or an episode of mania, or something that I had heard of, that I could compare it to. But for me, it seemed like those things went along with sort of other things, and possibly was affected by, say, what's going on around you. not necessarily, but I felt like it was just so clear that suddenly I would have this experience out of the blue, and then it would go away after a couple minutes. Like, it just was like, this doesn't make sense. This is nothing I've ever heard of, honestly. And I feel like one of the main ways that I've decided that I can separate out, what is a seizure and what is, say, a panic attack, which I don't really feel like I have panic attacks at. I felt like for me, the thing that seemed like maybe it was a panic attack was the seizures that caused a lot of anxiety, as well as you can start to get traumatized. Honestly, I think it's very traumatic to have a lot of seizures and not know what's going on, and it's like scary. And so when you have them for a long time and then you have one, it can trigger being like scared from it also. And then that increases, for me, it would then increase the anxiety. Because I was just like, what's happening? It's happening again. And it was just scary. So it would throw me off even more. And I do think that's one of the reasons that people get misdiagnosed also, is because of the trauma that happens with all the seizures. Can sound very emotional, which it is. However, it's related to having a seizure, not just out of the blue, or not related to, say, a subject that's difficult for someone. I just have experienced that when I'm, it would happen anytime. I could be at work, like, cleaning the floor. I worked at a restaurant for a while, and then suddenly it was like this whole thing was happening, and then I was just like I don't know what to do now. Because one of the problems for me was that I had been told that the experiences I was having were like spiritual experiences, and that it was negative energy, and I just needed to like protect myself more psychically to be able to not have these experiences, which I now know were seizures. So for one thing, I didn't want to explain to anyone that I thought I was having what other people said were spiritual experiences that were really unhappy and very negative. And that scared me. But also, like I said, then the thought that if it's, sounds psychiatric as well, people are just gonna be like, something's really wrong with her. And if I really thought that was the case, I think I felt like it would have been different. I really felt like in that situation, I was like, yes, I have depression. Yes, I have anxiety. Yes, things are hard. Yes, I get like emotional. Yes, I have PMDD and I get suicidal every month. But like, this is just different. And I just think it's so important when someone with epilepsy is talking to a doctor, say, who's never had a seizure, or a family member, or anyone, and trying to explain it, to have the doctor understand that the best way to be able to explain a seizure to them is to have, say, a description of a seizure by someone else with a seizure. Because that was the thing that finally worked for me to be able to understand what was going on. Because I had tonic clonic seizures, so I had been diagnosed with epilepsy, and I had been having them for 14 years before I figured out that I was also having focal aware seizures. Even though I was having these episodes, these experiences suddenly that made no sense, since I didn't know they were seizures. And like I said, all I could come up with, they're either psychic or psychiatric, was like, I don't want to tell anybody that either, because then they're gonna think I'm crazy and try to, I felt like people might, really try to do things to me that I didn't want, like put me in a psych hospital that I didn't want to be in. So I didn't tell people for 14 years. I tried to explain it a little bit when I was like 12, and I have some descriptions I wrote where I was trying to explain it. And they make sense to me now, but I can see how, but it didn't make sense to anybody else at the time. But like I said, so I knew I had epilepsy. I was reading the book, the Epilepsy Patient and Family Guide, by Orrin Davinsky, and there were descriptions in there by people with temporal lobe epilepsy. And because of that, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's exactly what it is. And then I've had a doctor say that because of that, I had confirmation bias, which means that you think you have something and you don't, but you're convinced because you know information about it that you do. And that's really troublesome because that's not the case. Like I said, it's hard to describe seizures, and to have somebody else say it where you're like, oh, okay, that is one of the ways to describe it, that somebody else came up with. Because, like I said, it's really hard to come up with what to say. And also to know that when somebody explains it, you can understand what they're talking about, even though someone who's never had a seizure won't totally understand. And so that's why I also think what's so important is when you talk to someone who is sure that they have a seizure and you are like, that's totally what it is, and in the terms and understanding that's different than somebody who's never had a seizure, I think that's a pretty clear indication that it's a seizure. Because if you've never had a seizure, I honestly don't think that if I were to explain it to you, it would really sound like something you'd experienced, especially if you're talking about multiple seizures, multiple types. And like I said, just this sense of like when somebody said, suddenly having an intense deja vu that was more real than real life, that it was so intense it was scary. Like I was like, oh my gosh, I've been telling people I have deja vu and it's kind of scary all my life, and all these people just say, yeah, I have deja vu too. And I was like, no, it's not like that. Like, it's not that simple. Like, if you have that, why aren't you scared? It didn't make sense to me. And then when someone with a seizure explained that it was totally scary and weird for them and so intense, then it was like, well, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And so I feel like that's really helpful. And I hope at some point to come up with a way to make like what I would call a seizure dictionary would be to have people, lots of different patient descriptions of different types of seizures, and then people who are, even if it was like a pamphlet at a neurologist's office where they could give it to you and have different descriptions by patients, and you could look at it and say, oh my gosh, that's the thing that makes sense to me. Because I had never heard of anything remotely close to the seizures that I was having. I had no idea they were seizures. Because doctors had asked me about basically kind of if I was having the symptoms of an absence seizure, or if I was having the symptoms of myoclonic jerks, or a motor seizure. Like, it's all they ever asked me was something that would relate to those things. No one ever asked me any questions related to anything that would sound like other types of focal aware seizures. And I think that is really unfortunate because, like I said, when you try to go to a neurologist and explain that to them, it can sound totally strange, and especially if you don't have anyone else to help you figure out how to say it. And that's why I feel like it would be so good to have other people's descriptions, because you can really get a sense of it. And that's why other people with epilepsy listen to my videos and like, oh my gosh, that's what it is. I've been trying to say it. Like, that's one of the hardest things about this, and I really believe that's why so many people get misdiagnosed or don't get a diagnosis, or just don't have doctors not believe you, and tell you it's all in your head, which is the worst thing a doctor can do, in my opinion. And I've experienced that with my other illnesses. And thanks for everyone's support. I've been super sick with my ME/CFS, and so I haven't been able to do any videos, and I'm really grateful I just decided to do one right now.